Hi students, Mr. A here. When I was involved in my economic studies, a professor once told me that economics is a picture. It's a big picture, and it has lots of pieces to it, but once you see it, you'll have it. Now, he didn't exactly tell me what that picture was, but one of the main ingredients for the economic picture I see is involved in today's presentation on the circular flow of money. The circular flow of money diagram, PowerPoint presentation number 1, defining micro and macroeconomics with key aspects of a functioning economy. The circular flow of money. At the beginning of every quarter, I always ask my students, what is the difference between micro and macroeconomics? Students invariably respond with, micro is small and macro is big. And I say, that is absolutely correct. But then I ask, what is the difference between micro and macroeconomics? That's when I usually begin to hear the crickets chirp, chirp, chirp. The good news is the answer is simple, and it is not demonstrated in any textbook the way you are about to see it demonstrated in this model. This is our first look at the circular flow of money in an economy. Households put money in businesses when they do what, I ask? That's right, buy goods, consume, or demand products. Businesses then put money back into households when they do what? That's right, provide jobs and pay workers while supplying goods. This is how money flows around the circle of our economy. So money flows clockwise around the circle. You should also know that goods flow the opposite direction, counterclockwise. Goods will not be indicated in this model. I felt it cluttered up the diagram when it is pretty obvious to see that wherever you see money flowing one direction, you should know goods are flowing in the opposite. So businesses provide workers with jobs which pay wages, salaries, and benefits, which puts money back into households. This is the first phase of understanding how money flows. It's simple, right? But there's a lot of economics here. And everything we will cover in this course will connect to this simple diagram. And I do mean everything. It's a simple picture of the economy. It's a model of the economy. But the diagram is not finished. There are more items to add to it. Notice in this diagram, households are at the bottom and business manufacturers are at the top. This is not the way it is normally laid out in most economic textbooks I have seen, and to me this is the most rational way to do it. Textbooks generally have households and businesses on the left or the right, and this is illogical. Soon we will be discussing trickle-down supply-side economic approaches, for example. This is where the government attempts to stimulate the economy by lowering taxes on business, contending the benefits will trickle down to the households. I suppose you can see why households should not then be on the left or the right and businesses opposite, right? Households need to be at the bottom if we're going to discuss trickle-down economics. So this is why I feel it is more rational and logical to have the diagram this way. Feel free to take a moment to think it over. Back to micro versus macroeconomics. Everything blue on the diagram will represent microeconomics. Everything green on the diagram will represent macroeconomics. I would also like to note that in economics textbooks I have seen, micro and macro have not been defined in this simple and visual way, so you can have a picture of what micro and macro are and how they differ. Notice households and businesses are both blue and green. This is because the basic principles of supply and demand, defining the role of businesses and households accordingly, apply to both micro and macro. Businesses, manufacturers are the suppliers, households are the consumers or demanders, if you will. And they are both involved in the micro and macro study. In fact, generally, the first 2 or 3 chapters of any micro or macro textbook are the same. The concepts of supply and demand are fundamental to both courses of study. So it's not until about the 3rd or 4th chapter that one textbook will go into micro and go in a different direction. The other will go into macro, a different direction. So we're going to start with the product market over on the left as we begin to break down the difference between micro and macro. The product market is all microeconomics. It is blue. This is where we will study how businesses maximize profit. And what is the purpose of being in business? A question I ask about 100 times per quarter. To maximize profit. Sometimes students will say, no, it's just to make money. The purpose of being in business is to make money. And I say, no, it's to maximize profit. And to prove that, I'll take a nickel or a penny out of my pocket, I'll slam it on the desk, and I'll say, so you have a business, and you'll be satisfied with this penny or this nickel? This is money in your business. The purpose of being in business is to make as much money as is possible with the options available to your particular model. And many important economic issues arise from this fact. There are many pros and cons to consider. The pros of the goal to maximize profit, that self-interest profit incentive, is what drives capitalism and has made us as an economy so successful. But on the other hand, the cons are we can see that businesses only focused on maximizing profit create some negative aspects, such as pollution, such as a deficiency in resources, and other social problems. And these make for interesting economic discussions. The product market is where 60% of this microeconomics course will be focused. This market contains the middlemen between the manufacturers or suppliers of businesses and households. Seldom, when we buy a good, do we go to the factory, manufacturer, or farm where it is produced. We generally purchase goods in stores or markets. This is the product market. There are 4 archetypal markets with applicable graphs in the product market. These markets will be discussed in a bit more detail in the next PowerPoint, but for now they are listed as perfect competition. This is when we have thousands of businesses in a market producing an identical product, such as a potato. This is like farmer goods. Number 2 is the opposite of that, monopoly. This is one business in a market without any competition. Number 3 is an oligopoly, when there are just a few firms in that market. My example would be auto manufacturers with the millions of cars driving around on the highways of our country. How many manufacturers of those automobiles exist? I've had students name up to 15, maybe, companies that produce autos. But really it comes down to between 5 and 7 major companies producing most of the cars we drive around. This makes it an oligopoly. The last one is monopolistic competition, which has elements of both perfect competition and monopoly. It's not identical products. They're slightly differentiated, such as toothpaste. There's many firms, and there is competition. On the other side of the circle, we witness the factor resource market. I call it these 2 names because varying textbooks refer to it differently. Some call it the factor market, some call it the resource market. This is all micro. This is where we will graph how the labor market functions to provide jobs for manufacturing businesses. The factor resource market is where 10% of this microeconomics course will be focused. These are the middlemen between the manufacturing businesses and households. This is where we see the costs of being in business, and there are 4 costs, or what we call factors of production, which will exist anytime there is a business doing business and involved in business. These 4 main costs will always occur when businesses are operational and will be explained in more detail in PowerPoint presentation number 2. They are land. Whenever you have a business, you have to have a place for that business. Those are considered your land costs. Number 2, the largest cost of being in business in most cases is labor, what you have to pay your workers when you are in business. The third factor of production, cost of being in business, is called capital. Capital refers to the resources business manufacturers require to produce the goods they make. In economics, resources are generally defined as goods which produce goods. And in this area, we have 2 types of resources. First, there is the variable cost resources, meaning resources which vary with output. A shirt manufacturing firm who produces millions of shirts will have high costs when it comes to cloth, buttons, thread, labels. If they produce 0 shirts, these costs will be 0, therefore varying with output. Fixed cost capital are costs which do not change with output. I visualize the machinery, the robots, the large infrastructure aspects businesses require to produce goods. If a business is making monthly payments on the machinery it is purchasing or owns, has title to, it will have to make the same payments every month, which will remain the same whether it's producing 0 output or millions of units of output. The last cost of being in business within the factors of production is entrepreneurship. This refers to the payments businesses make to the owners of the business and the management of a business. Now let's move on to macroeconomics. This is represented by the green aspects of the diagram. In this case, we have government and the banks. Government and banks are not in the circular flow. The banks we're referring to up there we call the Fed, stands for the Federal Reserve Bank, which is the main administrative national bank of U.S., which establishes policy for all the banks in the U.S. When banks or the government are holding dollars, those dollars are not in the circular flow. They are not on the circle, in other words. The government is represented by being inside the circle, but it's off the circular flow. The same with the banks at the upper left. So let's move on to the government. The government affects the money supply with fiscal policy. It's a fairly technical term, but as many things in economics, the terms seem technical, but the concepts are often, as in this case, very simple. This is the financial aspect of the government. And fiscal policy is the government doing 2 things. It's taxing and it's spending, which impacts businesses and households. The government taxes business manufacturers, and it gives money back to them in contracts. The government taxes households and spends money on households, mainly probably jobs. The taxes would include income tax, property tax, sales tax, etc. Looks like Ben Franklin is being very careful down there in the right-hand corner. Macroeconomics, the second part then is the banks, what we call monetary policy. The government is applying fiscal policy in its financial aspects. The bank is applying what we call monetary policy. Banks and the Fed, or the Federal Reserve Bank, have the most effective control over the supply of money in circulation. The Fed is the national bank of the U.S. The control of the money supply exercised by the banking system is called monetary policy. Monetary policy controlled by the Fed involves 3 main tools which have the effect of expanding or reducing the amount of money in circulation. These tools are, in brief, we'll cover them in more detail later, are controlling interest rates, called the discount rate, controlling the reserve requirements necessary for banks in terms of how much money they have to have in their reserves, and open market operations, which refers to the buying and selling of bonds. These tools are applied to influence consumption, spending, employment, unemployment, and inflation. Monetary policy will be explained in more detail in PowerPoint presentation number 2. So, in finishing up with our macro aspects, now that you had a brief overview of the government, fiscal policy, and the bank's monetary policy, we're going to look at imports and exports, in which we will cover the definitions of leakages and injections. Imports. Households purchase goods produced in foreign countries, markets. Note the green horizontal arrows to the right of households. So, we receive ships into our harbors full of containers bringing goods into the United States. This is the one area where I've shown goods coming in with the imports arrow down there showing goods entering into households. But notice, even though the goods are entering, which way is the money go? Which way is the money going when imports come into the country? We see that money is exiting the circular flow into foreign economies. So this is then called a leakage. Money is leaking out of the circular flow when imports are purchased by households. So, in continuing with imports and exports, let's look at exports. This is demonstrated by the upper right-hand corner of the diagram. Manufacturing businesses sell their U.S.-produced goods to foreign markets. Notice the arrow that says exports. The goods themselves are leaving the country. But the money is doing what? It's coming into the businesses. So U.S.-produced goods then enter foreign markets and economies, and in doing so, money enters the circular flow from these foreign economies. So the arrow showing the goods moving out, the ship leaving for foreign countries from America there, sending money back to the U.S. This monetary entry is called an injection. So exports create an injection of funds, money into the circular flow. It's also worthy of note that money re-entering the circular flow from banks or the government is also referred to as an injection. Money going into the government and the banks is called a leakage. So this concludes PowerPoint presentation number 1 on the circular flow of money. Next, in PowerPoint presentation number 2, we're going to explore deeper into the details of micro and macroeconomics. I'll do my best to keep it short.